No doubt that many drivers for Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash are earning well below the minimum wage. We saw that in Minnesota, right? Even with tips, even with the tips included, this new paper finds. So there's a lot of research out there, ladies and gentlemen. The problem is many drivers just simply don't do the business math. They just look at a fare and they think, okay, I'll do 20, 30 of those, and that's going to amount to some money, but they don't really take into consideration what got them there, like what it takes to do 20, 30 trips a day. So let's dive in here. Many gig drivers earn less than local minimum wage after expenses. UC Berkeley finds researchers analyze data from 1,088 drivers in major metro areas using the Gridwise app. And Gridwise, very reputable app, solid data. Gig companies don't really like it because, you know, they expose so much important data that, you know, us drivers can fall back on and make decisions on. But I like what they offer. I like what they do. Drivers face high expenses and lack employee benefits, leading some states to advocate for reform. Many Americans looking to make at least their local minimum wage might be unable to count on gig driving as their primary income source. It's just the take rates just got ridiculous. In an analysis of 52,370 trips by 1,088 drivers in the Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco Bay Area, and Seattle metros in January 2022, researchers at the Berkeley Labor Center and the Center for Wage and Employment Dynamics found drivers across 6 ride-hailing and delivery platforms often earned less than the local minimum wage. Now, that research was just done for those 6 major metropolitan cities. This is really the truth for any city, right, or any state that Uber and Lyft are not paying the minimum wage. Once you do the proper math, right, once you really break it down, you will realize you are not even making minimum wage these days. That's why I highly always encourage private trips, cash trips. I show you below at Gig Rocket. You got to step into that arena and start becoming an independent contractor. They are certainly not treating us as independent contractors. We've got a battle going on right now. There are hearings in the California Supreme Court in San Francisco about, you know, whether whether Proposition 22 is unconstitutional and if drivers should be deemed employees. I just say make a driver a proper independent contractor. Let them be an independent contractor, but Uber and Lyft have to abide by the laws of independent contractorship, which they're not doing. Drivers know this in California, the multiplier, right? We had the multiplier for a year where you were setting your own rates. That was the closest we ever got to ISC status. So, you know, these 6 cities here, they say that found that the drivers across these 6 ride-hailing and delivery platforms often earned less than the local minimum wage, including with tips after expenses like gas. The researchers used data from the rideshare and delivery assistance app Gridwise to examine drivers who worked 10 or more hours. To be sure, many drivers on these platforms work just a few hours a week, and the researchers' results may not apply to those drivers. Nearly half of the drivers drove for multiple apps, and 42% of non-DoorDash drivers worked 32 hours or more per week. Here's a little bit of a breakdown. Passenger and delivery driver net hourly earnings. Passenger drivers in California, net pay without tips, $7.12. Net pay with tips, $9.09. Net employee equivalent pay without tips, $5.97. Net employee equivalent pay with tips, $7.63. Passenger Drivers and other net pay without tips $10.64, net pay with tips $12.94, net employee equivalent pay without tips $9.18, net employee equivalent pay with tips $11.14. Delivery drivers California, net pay without tips $5.93, net pay with tips. As you can see, delivery drivers heavily rely on their tips. With the tips, $13.62. The net employee equivalent pay without tips would be $4.98, atrocious. Net employee equivalent pay with tips would be $11.43. Delivery driver other, net pay without tips 48 cents. Net pay with tips $9.87. Net employee equivalent pay without tips 40 cents. Net employee equivalent pay with tips $8.36. Wow, that's eye-opening. In some cases, drivers earned less than half of the local minimum wage in net employee equivalent pay, which adjusts drivers' net pay over the entire time they're driving or looking for gigs for factors like employer payroll taxes and employee benefits. Delivery drivers in the metro areas studied outside California relied almost solely on tips and earn just 40 cents net per hour adjusted when excluding gratuities. Wow, unbelievable. Pay for gig drivers rarely exceeds the employee equivalent local minimum wage. The authors wrote, most non-casual drivers would be better off if they were classified as employees rather than as independent contractors. Money-wise, yes. Flexibility-wise, out the window, right? That would just end gig work right there. Why are people doing this? It's because of the time factor. I can put in hours at 4 a.m. if I wanted to. Delivery drivers overall made at or above minimum wage in medium gross hourly earnings with tips $21.10 in California and $18.94 outside of California. And passenger drivers made above minimum wage in all metro areas before tips $21.61 in California and $25.41 outside of California. These gross wages skyrocket when looking at engaged time or time spent picking up and dropping off passengers or food rather than looking for the next job. Still, expenses eat up much of these gross earnings. For delivery drivers, expenses total $7.44 per shift hour in California and $7.60 outside. For passenger drivers, it's $14.03 and $11.68 respectively. By the way, the link's going to be below the video. Business Insider reached out to the 6 companies analyzed in the paper. In a statement, a DoorDash spokesman said, as the authors make clear, this study is based on an incomplete and unrepresentative sample of app-based workers in these 5 cities. That's their go-to excuse. If they had bothered to include Dashers in their study, they would have learned that California Dashers, for example, earned around 36 per hour. BS. While on deliveries in 2023, an average a 41% increase from 2020 before Prop 22 was enacted. DoorDash further noted in the statement that the study omitted 654 DoorDash drivers from its net earnings analysis on the basis that the data doesn't include distances and shift times. The Lyft spokesman noted earlier this year, Lyft announced a new commitment. So they're continuing with this lie, right? Where drivers will always make at least 70% of rider fares each week after external fees. And they pack all the fees. What they take from you is in those external fees. In Q1 of this year, the median US Lyft driver earned $31.10, including tips and bonuses per hour of engaged time after taking into account estimated expenses such as gas and maintenance. That's around $24.25 per engaged hour, improving the driver experience is essential to our purpose, and we are constantly listening to driver feedback. An Uber spokesman said that nationally drivers earn more than $30 an hour while working on the app. That's interesting because you pushed out messages in LA that you could make 20-something dollars, including tips. So I don't know why they have to keep on pushing. DoorDash pushes the lies. Lyft still pushes the 70% bullshit after external fee lies. And Uber still goes directly to their 30s when they know it's not 30s. It's lucky if it's 20s. Research using data from actual driver earnings shows that California drivers earned on average $34.46 per active hour, including tips, which is a 26% increase compared to pre-Prop 22 data, said a spokesman for the Protect app-based driver services coalition based in California. The other three companies did not directly reply to the request for comment before publication. To be sure, in February, an Uber representative told Business Insider that the vast majority of drivers are satisfied and that as of last quarter, drivers in the US were making about 33 per utilized hour. What a joke. Before expenses. In February, Lyft said its median US driver who used a personal vehicle earned about 30 per engaged hour before driving expenses and 23 an hour once some driving expenses were accounted for. The challenges of gig work. Across Uber, Lyft, Uber Eats, DoorDash, Grubhub, and Instacart, drivers almost universally had net hourly earnings well under the local minimum wage in the 5 studied metros, 15 in Boston, 15 in Chicago, $16.90 in Los Angeles, $18.07 in San Francisco, and $19.97 in Seattle. Since drivers are classified as independent contractors, they don't need to be paid minimum wage in most cities for their time and expenses between rides. The authors note that these companies often engage in algorithmic wage discrimination. Algorithmic wage discrimination is real, ladies and gentlemen. These conditions allow the companies to take shares of passenger fares commissions that are higher than the levels in more competitive platform industries and to pay their workers less than what they would receive if there was more competition among the companies. Drivers pay out of pocket for expenses incurred when they're waiting for their next ride, and they are not paid by the app. About half of the miles driven per shift and a third of the shift is spent during those waiting periods for delivery drivers. About a third of the miles and 28% of the shift time are spent between gigs for passenger drivers. As part of Proposition 22, a law passed in 2020, California drivers are promised earnings of at least 120% of the local minimum wage, excluding tips. When minimum pay mandates aren't met, gig companies must pay adjustments. Though drivers under Proposition 22 don't get overtime or paid sick leave, they get paid 35 cents per mile. 35 cents per mile while picking up or dropping off passengers. Drivers who work frequently also must be reimbursed for part of their healthcare premium expenses if enrolled in the state's health benefit exchange. The report found that even with adjustments excluding tips, San Francisco and LA passenger drivers made less than those in the other 3 metro areas, though they earned $3 more factoring in tips, while 2/3 of DoorDash drivers and just under half of Uber Eats drivers had the incomes adjusted. Just 5% of Uber drivers did. Efforts to reform gig driving. This month, the California Supreme Court will hear a case concerning whether Proposition 22 is unconstitutional. Meanwhile, in 2023, Seattle passed a law mandating that drivers must be paid at least 64 cents a minute, plus $1.50 per mile, and at least $5.62 per trip. New York City also has a minimum compensation standard for gig drivers. Minneapolis also just increased their earnings by 20%. The authors note that when drivers have only a handful of driving gig options. Companies can pay lower wages, and they can often get away with it since many workers are immigrants with few other employment opportunities. The UC Berkeley study isn't the first to try to document the earnings of gig drivers. For example, a study commissioned by the state of Minnesota and released on March the 8th found that in 2022, drivers in the Twin Cities metro area earned $13.63 an hour after expenses below Minneapolis's minimum wage of $15.57 per hour. Uber and Lyft took issue with the study's calculation of driving expenses. Uber and Lyft threatened to pull out of Minnesota over the city's new pay plan for gig drivers. But as we know, they bluffed, they chickened out, they accepted the new rates. A study published earlier this year of over 500,000 US gig drivers from Gridwise found that the average Uber driver made $25 an hour before expenses, including tips and bonuses. The average Lyft, Uber Eats, and DoorDash driver had hourly earnings of $24, $18, and $14 respectively. Using Gridwise data, Big Lake data estimated net earnings in Massachusetts to be $12.82 an hour, and in 2023, including tips, with expenses totaling about half of gross earnings. This month, Massachusetts sued Uber and Lyft in an attempt to classify drivers as employees. I think they have a good chance in Massachusetts. Over the past year, several gig drivers have told Business Insider that their gigs are less profitable than they used to be. For example, Uber and Lyft drivers have said the ride-hailing giants are taking a larger cut, which is true, of rider fares. These frustrations have led to driver protests and calls for higher guaranteed pay. Many of those protests introduced by his truly rideshare professor. While some drivers are unsatisfied with their pay, many Americans have turned to gig work in recent years as a source of income. The share of Bank of America customers receiving income from ride-hailing roughly tripled from less than 0.4% in March to about 1.2% as of March, exceeding pre-pandemic levels according to a Bank of America Institute report published in late April. Now, if you are a gig driver struggling to make ends meet, or if you want to bring in your own data, or if you want to show your own calculations and show that you are indeed earning less than the minimum wage, just hit up the reporter, NSHEIDLOWER at businessinsider.com. NS Heidlauer at businessinsider.com. There it is. And this, I'll put that. Or great guy Jay Zinkula, JZINKULA at Business Insider. If you want to share any of your stories with them, those are the people to go to. Sergio put me together with them, and they are remarkable. They really are. Those reporters are on top of it, and they love your stories. So hit them up. Leave your comments and give us some feedback from your city, from your state. Thank you.